Hello, welcome. This is the Online Ethics Center's Fall 2022 webinar series, Bringing Ethics into the Conversation. I'm Caitlin Wiley. I'm an associate professor in science, technology, and society at the University of Virginia, where I teach engineering ethics and data ethics. So in case you don't know the Online Ethics Center, we are a digital repository for resources on teaching and learning about ethics and engineering and science. The OEC also fosters a community of faculty, students, researchers, and other professionals who come together to discuss ethics. So please check out our website at onlineethics.org. The theme of our webinar series this fall is sustainability and environmental justice. You may remember that that was our theme in the spring too, but we had so much to say about it that we're going to continue it this fall. And I'm delighted to host our speaker today, Dr. Khalid Kadir. So Dr. Kadir is a continuing lecturer at UC Berkeley. He teaches courses in the Global Poverty and Practice program, as well as in a political economy and civil and environmental engineering. After completing his Ph.D. in environmental engineering at Berkeley, Khalid focused his research on the complex role that engineering expertise plays in the politics of international development and poverty alleviation. His current work focuses on the intersection of poverty, expertise, and politics. He is a recipient of the 2017 Distinguished Teaching Award, UC Berkeley's most prestigious honor for teaching, as well as the 2020 Constellation Prize and the 2019 American Cultures Teaching Award. After Khalid's talk, he'll then discuss this important work with Valerie Michel, a PhD student at the University of Virginia. And then we'll finish with questions from you. So to ask a question at any time, really, you can type in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And then at the end of the session, I'll read it to Khalid and Valerie to answer. So Khalid, we're delighted to have you. Thank you.
Super excited to be here. Thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and share screen and put some slides up here. Yeah, I think that should work. Are we seeing the slides?
Looks good.
Cool. All right. So to start, I mentioned to Caitlin and Valerie before we got going that I'm gonna try to talk as fast as possible so we can spend more time in questions and conversation than just me talking to myself with slides. But I want to begin by sort of giving credit where credit was due here. This title, I've sort of leaned on a poem by Muhammad Ali. He first made it public in '63 on a TV interview, and then later in 1975, someone in the graduating class at Harvard, he was speaking to them, said, "Give us a poem." And he said, "Me, we." There's a couple different versions of how people understand that. It was spoken, it wasn't written. Does he mean we like we having fun, or does he mean we like all of us we, or does he mean both? I kind of take the biggest one where I assume he means both. And I find that like a useful way for thinking about what I'm trying to communicate today. Sort of ultimately the core message that I want to get across is how do we move from an approach to ethics, an approach to our profession and our role in our profession that moves from me, like as an individual, to we as a collective, as a community, as part of larger communities. So just some brief sort of catching us up. I don't know where everyone's at in terms of environmental justice. You know, it's not just the old history, but it has deep roots going back in the United States to the era of slaveholding and Jim Crow. Even after the Civil Rights Act passed, we continued to see this happen. I'll give you a quick sort of case study of 1979 in Houston. African-American community was opposing a landfill and brought the first Title VI lawsuit challenging the siting of a waste facility. The neighborhood was a middle-class neighborhood in Houston, and it was 82% African-American. Famously, during that time, one of the foremost academics in the world of environmental justice, Dr. Robert Bullard, found that all 5 owned garbage dumps in the city of Houston, 6 out of 8 owned garbage incinerators, and 3 of the 4 privately owned landfills were sited in Black neighborhoods. This, despite the fact that Black people only made up 1/4 of the city's population. So again, 25% of Houston at the time was African-American. all 5 garbage dumps, 6 out of 8 garbage incinerators, and 3 out of 4 privately owned landfills were all in Black neighborhoods. And this was sort of a case where clearly there's a great deal of environmental inequity there, like who has to deal with these facilities. But the case was ultimately lost, and the landfill was built. The reason the case was lost is because those filing it couldn't prove that the discrimination was intentional. So in that moment, the injustice was real, the discrimination was real, but because they couldn't prove it was intentional, they lost that case. And I think that says something about the way we approach these issues. This fast forward up to today, the Department of Justice right now is investigating the city of Houston because it hasn't adequately addressed environmental racism in the city. Residents in primarily African American and Latino communities have long complained about illegal dumping in their neighborhoods. The city has ignored them. Moreover, the Department of Justice believes this goes a lot deeper, as in the last few decades, 11 out of 13 garbage incinerators and landfills have been placed in communities that are primarily where primarily people of color live. So I share these sort of 2 examples, to get at that there's a long history to this, and it's also a current ongoing history. It's not just history, it's our present. This is the same city, it's the same problem. The first iteration over 40 years ago, the second iteration is just now under investigation federally. It's also all around us, environmental justice. This isn't just Houston. Cancer Alley in Louisiana with oil refineries. There's Uniontown, Alabama with coal ash spilling into rivers. Flint, Michigan, we all know well about, and that problem has still not been addressed. Those pipes have still not been replaced. Richmond, California, close to where I live, there's refinery pollution from Chevron, and that runs up the entire refinery corridor. Here's a image based on some research produced out of University of Washington and UC Berkeley. And it's a particularly interesting image because it's showing responsibility versus who is affected. So here they're looking at pollution exposure by population, and they're noting that relative to the amount of pollution they produce, how much are different groups exposed to. And you see that Latinos and African Americans are exposed to far more pollution than they produce. And this is a phenomenon that we see happen in a meta way, sort of international scale. Think about climate change. Who is responsible for climate change and who is suffering from climate change? And we see this form of injustice where other people are causing the problem and different ones are then suffering from the results of it. And this is really kind of, in my view, very much at the heart of some of the environmental injustices that we see. So why does this happen? Here I'm going to lean on some work by Mohai and Pello, a sort of classic reading on environmental justice. It's an annual review. They give a number of reasons that they find in the literature. One is that it's economic. And there's sort of 2 versions of this. This is ultimately about markets. One is that industry's just looking for the cheapest place to put their facilities. And so they put them where land and labor are cheap. The other version of this is that industry puts facilities somewhere and then the demographics shift. Those who can leave, primarily rich and white, leave, and others, poor and folks of color, move in because of the cheaper property. So ultimately, this explanation is that this is ultimately about money and who has money and who doesn't. A second explanation that they come forward with is a socio-political one. This is industry or government seeks the path of least resistance. As poor communities of color are the most politically disenfranchised, facilities get located where they live. So this is an explanation that's ultimately about power and political power and those who lack it facing increased burdens. And the third explanation that they bring forward is that we're seeing the present day effects of historical policies that were intended to segregate. Ultimately, this third explanation is that this is a form of racial discrimination. And they're saying some of this is side effect discrimination, that discrimination in one area, for example, zoning and redlining, leads to discriminatory outcomes in another, i.e. the siting of facilities. And this isn't just old history. We still see gerrymandering happening all over the place today, which shifts the sort of voting zones and often along racial lines. The other version of racial discrimination that they put forward is that, and here they lean on a thesis by Charles Mills, that it's easier to locate industrial waste and factory pollution in places where we already see them as inherently dirty, and we see Black and brown neighborhoods or nations as inherently dirty, so we don't have a problem with that. Ultimately, when we zoom out, I think if we want to get to like a big picture reason of why this happens, it's because we're still okay with racism and white supremacy as a society. It continues to happen, and we don't muster the political will to change anything about that. So, okay, that's good and fine. And a note on that, I think that this is perhaps a simple explanation, but I think it's one that's telling of that we still see these outcomes in society. It's pretty, I mean, incredibly well documented that we see these unequal outcomes and they keep happening. And I think that political will and the lack of political will to change it, in part because it doesn't affect many of us who have more political power, and in part because we often benefit from the siting of a facility in a place that doesn't directly affect us, it affects other people. So it's kind of easier to look the other way. So that's all fine and good, but we're here to talk about engineering. And the common thing that I hear as a response to this was, well, we didn't do it. Don't blame us. Why are you pointing? Why is this a talk about engineers? What do we have to do with environmental justice? And I sort of push back on that, and I say, well, how do you think these facilities were designed and constructed? There's an awful lot of engineering in a chemical plant, an oil refinery, or waste incinerator. And how do we think that these facilities got sited? Someone had to complete an environmental impact report, and often it's an environmental engineer that has to sign off on these. And who did the modeling to determine that pollution wasn't going to be so bad to make the case that this would be okay? My point here is that engineers are involved in every piece of this. Engineers are involved, in fact, in every piece of infrastructure that gets built in the United States. So if we see racist outcomes in our infrastructure, we might ask, well, doesn't that imply that engineers must be somehow part of the problem, intentional or not? So with that in mind, I want to jump to how is it that we might be able to fix this? What can we do about this? And I think there's two angles that I want to emphasize. One is a personal angle, and it's not the one I want to spend the most time on, but I don't want to let it go. I think that we need to think about our personal individual role in this. And I think we have to, in that process, I think we can ask two simple questions about the work we're doing. If we're trying to go out in the world and do things better or solve problems or fix things, I think the very first question we should ask is, how are we related to the causes of those problems? Or put alternatively, how do we benefit from the existence of those problems? And the second question I think we can ask ourselves as professionals is, how do we benefit from the process of trying to solve or address or fix these problems? And I think this question has to be specific. We have to unpack how we benefit from the very specific method of addressing the problem that we're pursuing, rather than answering this in sort of an abstract, generalized manner. So, you know, there's a air pollution problem in this town, and I'm working on it. Well, I'm getting paid to work on that. What does that mean? How does that compromise my role in this conversation? I think if we consider many of the social justice issues that surround us today, most of us, though obviously not all of us, will find that we're in a bit of a sticky situation when we ask these questions. Consider something seemingly distant as nitrate contamination in drinking water in California's Central Valley. This is an issue I've worked on for many years. To answer that first question, how are we related to the cause of the problem, or how do we benefit from its existence? We have to consider how we benefit from not having to provide these affected communities with their basic human right to clean water. How are these agricultural communities these are agricultural communities, and our food is less expensive because we don't have to pay the full cost of what it would take to attain that food in a more just manner. So we're related to the cause of the problem at a sort of a systems level. We benefit from a system that marginalizes agricultural laborers. If we had to pay the full cost of that labor and the cost of ensuring justice, environmental or otherwise, for California's agricultural communities, we'd have to accept that our food would be more expensive, and or those who earn massive profits from ag in California would have to make less money. This is just one way in which we're directly connected to this specific issue of environmental injustice. And there are many more connections between us and these same communities that have nitrate in their water, but I just wanted to put forward the most obvious one. The second question, how do we benefit from the process of solving the problem? I think we need to look at how we're paying our salaries and building our careers. It's no doubt good to focus our work on trying to solve problems of injustice, but when we are making money and building careers by addressing these problems in the very specific manners that requires our skills and expertise, one might rightly question our ethical position. Are we asserting that this is how to solve it because that's what we do? That's what we know how to do? Are we walking around carrying proverbial hammers, looking for nails, and every time we call something a nail, we get a paycheck? That's an ethical problem for us that we have to take seriously as engineers. There's also sort of a professional role here. How should we be engaging with issues of social justice as a discipline? I think this gets more interesting and much more complicated. And I'm only going to try to address this briefly. And I think first we have a historical problem. A lot of injustice has resulted from the work done by our profession. There's no way around this, whether it's militarism, colonialism, unsustainable resource extraction, climate change, the environmental injustices I was describing earlier. You can go on and on with this. We are deeply inside each one of these as a profession, and that's a history we have to take account of and repair. And second, I think engineering has an epistemological problem. We have a methods problem. The methods we use in engineering are very reductive. They're fundamentally positivist in their origin. And if you're an engineer and you don't know what positivism is, then that means that you're unaware of the philosophical roots of your own disciplinary techniques. Now, that sounds pretty wonky, academic, and maybe even a little uppity, but I encourage you to think about that for a minute if you're an engineer. That engineers are overwhelmingly not trained to understand that what they learned is rooted in a philosophical tradition that privileges certain ways of knowing and understanding the world. And that the ways we're taught how to understand and act upon the world are not the only ones. And in fact, there are many, many others. Our knowledge, sort of put in lay terms, is not capital T truth, but rather it's a partial truth viewed through one narrow and generally utilitarian lens that has embedded in it certain values and priorities. There are an immense array of methods for producing knowledge about the world around us, knowledge that is used to understand, define, and act upon the world. The methods of engineering are valuable, but they're only one of them, and they're pretty narrow. So with that, what does this have to do with ethics? Let me bring this full circle and talk about what we came here to talk about today. This is ultimately about ethics, but not ethics in the way that we generally teach that field in our engineering ethics courses. Engaging with these questions requires a deeper, more serious engagement with ethics and justice. And fundamentally, our position in this conversation makes us ethically compromised. That doesn't mean we can't engage in this kind of work. I think we're obligated to, but I think we need to be aware of the ways in which we're compromised. I think we have to ask of ourselves some questions such as how might we engage in this space in a way that's ethically sound, whatever engineering space you're engaging in. What are the things you need to think about? How might we center principles of justice in our engineering work? And what would that mean for how, where, and with whom we do our work? And as a profession, how might we begin to undo, repair, and make up for the forms of environmental injustice that have been a part of our professional practices in the past? To bring that from me to we, I think we need to start thinking about history. Whenever we're engaging with engineering projects, we have to think about how the work we do might rectify historical injustices, might make up for past practices that have resulted in the current inequities we see. This opens up space for a conversation around reparations, affirmative actions, different ways to make up for things that were done wrong previously. And that's ultimately deeply embedded within the concept of justice. Second, I think we have to really focus on this concept of relationality. And this is another one of those kind of wonky academic concepts, but what I think we need to understand is that people aren't just out there poor, living in isolation, or out there breathing dirty air, living in isolation. That dirty air, that poverty, is in direct relation to everyone else who shares community with those people. So to the extent that you and I fill up our vehicles with electricity or gasoline, that has to be generated somewhere or extracted somewhere. And so we have a relationship to the folks who are involved in the extraction or suffering from the extraction and refining of those chemicals. So thinking about the world as relational, that we have a place in that relationship, that privilege and oppression are part of a spectrum. They're not independent spaces that exist and we just want everyone to have the same privileges. In fact, they're really rooted in systems of domination, which is about some over others. And I think when we start thinking about our place in this world as relational, it complicates our understanding of things that we don't like, because we say, well, how am I related to that thing I don't like? And what is my ethical responsibility as a result of that? The third thing I want to bring forward in trying to move from thinking about ethics as an individual phenomenon to more of a collective or societal understanding of how we approach ethics, a justice-based approach, is that I think we need to focus more on centering the voices of those who are most affected by the issues we're trying to address. We need to center those voices, ensure that they have meaningful, if not the driver's seat at the tables that we're sitting at. Now, to do these things within the context of engineering is going to require first an epistemological transformation. I think epistemology is about how you know things. It's how do you know what you know? What are the methods that you use to understand the world? And this epistemological transformation to center the voices of marginalized communities is going to require us to value other forms of knowing beyond the quantitative, positivist, and empirical, the methods that really dominate the work of engineers today. And this epistemological transformation has deeply practical implications. It changes our curriculum. It adds new courses. It changes what we teach in our courses. It changes our research methods that we engage in. It gets us to ask new research questions. And as practitioners, it changes how and where we do our professional work, who we work for, and who we're accountable to in our work. In all of that, I think we can start thinking about what is it that motivates us to do our engineering work, and is it private market demand? Do we have ideological ideas about what progress means? Are we motivated by justice, and how does that show up in our work? And I think we can ask what responsibilities do we have for the systems we take part in? Ultimately, the short version of that is, to whom are we accountable? I think asking that accountability question is a really quick way of understanding how we're compromised and how our work may not meet the needs that we aspire to meet. If we're trying to build a more equitable, just world, are we accountable to those who are not experiencing justice or equity right now? And if not, might that make it hard to ensure that we're doing the work we claim we're doing? Finally, I think to reframe engineering is really important if we want to do this work. I think we need to reframe engineering and what it means to engineer, to embrace being critical. And I don't mean being negative. I mean critique. I mean critique in the way that we might critique a work of Shakespeare to better understand it. I think we need to recognize the limits of our professional training, and we need to embrace engaging in critique that goes beyond the technical, considering how we might render problems political as opposed to just technical, and redraw our control volumes as systems diagrams to think about power, history, context into the frame. I think we can think about enlarging what it means to be an engineer. We're not a wrench that we pull out of a toolbox, and to recognize that we have political positions in relation to the work we do in the communities we work with. And the idea of an engineer, as it's commonly understood, doesn't capture all that we are. We're community members. You may be a voter, you might be neighbors, you're consumers. And I think to recognize that we're not outsiders to the projects we work on, but we're actually connected to them in complicated ways. And that political relationship is one that deserves scrutiny and needs to be attended to. And finally, that if we want to engage in sort of more just engineering work, we may need to change the way a lot of engineering work happens. As opposed to this one-off ad hoc consulting, we might think about sustained long-term engagement with the communities we want to support. And this is a different kind of commitment that's perhaps less enticing than the high-tech project that you drop in, do, and leave. Doesn't lend itself to the savior story the same way. But I think it's rooted in an understanding that social injustices that we see around us, they're not discrete problems that we can just solve and walk away from. They're processes that require a broader conception of what it means to be an engineer in our professional praxis, and they require us to engage more deeply. And I'll finish with one of my favorite quotes, and to sort of remind myself and everyone else that what I brought forward today is nothing new. Dr. King shared in 1967 that we have to move from being thing-oriented to people-oriented. And it feels sort of prophetic to hear him, to see these words for me, that he's bringing forward the problem of machines and computers. I mean, 1967, and he's talking about machines and computers, profit motives and property rights. When these are more important than people, we're going to see racism, militarism, and extreme materialism. We're not going to be able to do much about it. And I think that this is a constant reminder for me that these ideas are not new, but they're often not ideas that we're taught about in our engineering curricula and practice. So with that, I'll leave it open. I went a little longer than I wanted to, but I hope that was useful. And Caitlin and Valerie, I'll pass it over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Khalid. Wow, it's such powerful quotes to start and to end, and such powerful messages in between. Thank you for that. So let me introduce Valerie. And Valerie Michelle is a PhD candidate in systems engineering at the University of Virginia. Her research is focused on equitable policy and decision-making for coastal climate adaptation and risk management. She is a student of Dr. Garrick Louie, whose research seeks to build capacity for sustained access to essential services in marginalized areas, including water, sanitation, and food security. So I think you guys have a lot to talk about with your overlapping interests. Please, Valerie.
Yeah, so thank you so much. That was really nice to listen, and I had a lot of thoughts coming up throughout it. But I thought I'd start with that last quote. One thing in systems engineering is that we learned that metrics are at the core of driving decision making. And I was just kind of hoping you could shed light on, do you think in a capitalist society where money is the main metric driver, that justice, especially environmental justice, is kind of feasible ever? It's just kind of a dark question.
Yeah, no, it is a dark question, but there's a couple things I want to bring forward on that. I absolutely think it's feasible, but not through the way you implied the question. I think it's feasible because people will stand up and fight for it, beyond the narrow conception of capitalist priorities or metrics-based priorities. So yes, I think it's feasible, but not through the dominant mechanisms that are out there. And I think that in one of the things that it behooves us is to recognize, like, what values get inscribed in a sort of quantitative approach to work. And those who study data justice and data literacy would bring a lot more of this forward than I will. But just a couple of thinking about, like, we prioritize efficiency. It's literally baked into Solver on Excel, and efficiency is like a common route that we bring forward, but we often don't ask whose efficiency are we bringing forward. Did I freeze there, or did you freeze? I'm not sure which one of us did.
I'm not sure. I think it was me.
Right. Good deal. So I think we have to think about how numbers sort of bring forward a sort of approach that's based on efficiency, but efficiency may not always be the right way to approach things. I think about, when you choose to spend time with people you love, you hopefully don't try to, like, make that time as efficient as possible, but instead you sort of have a different approach to it. And I think that I bring that example because, like, maybe we need to think about inserting love and care into our projects that don't focus on efficiency in the way quantitative approaches really narrow what we can and can't do. So yes, I think it's possible, but I think that push is going to come from outside the dominant frames that we see within capitalism.
Yeah, your talk kind of made me think of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and a lot of their decision making, especially in environmental work, is benefit analysis.
Yeah.
So when they're thinking of which homes should we buy out, which communities should we protect, it's going to be the wealthiest infrastructure.
Yeah.
And they've, had many lawsuits against them with, from Katrina to, water issues. And a lot of those resulted in them being deemed they did mess up, but it wasn't intentional, which
Right.
made me think of what you had originally said.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And it's interesting because that approach is scholars of both engineering expertise and of capitalism, in particular neoliberal capitalism, write about this idea of depoliticization, the idea that we take something that's political, but we depoliticize. And I think that cost benefit analysis, or a lot of numerical analysis, quantitative analysis, do just that. Wendy Brown writes about the economization of all spheres in life, and it has this sort of seductive attraction, because now you and I don't have to sit down and talk about, well, which homes are we going to take down and which homes aren't we, and this becomes a political conversation and it's messy. Instead, we're going to just remove ourselves from that and run this quantitative analysis and not even engage with the politics of the issue.
Yeah.
We are, of course, in being political, but we're doing it in a way that hides the way we're being political and inscribe certain values of what take priority and what don't. And I think we need to learn to be political again, and to have these difficult political conversations about who's going to bear the cost and who's going to gain the benefit, so that we can be explicit about that, and then we can think about, well, who has historically done this if we want to do these sorts of things.
Yeah, that's actually something I've been kind of grappling with in my research, because there's these vulnerability and environmental justice indices that are popping up everywhere to sort of guide decision makers in identifying vulnerable communities. But what I've kind of realized is there's so much underlying history when it comes to things like redlining, that it's not just where are we now, but where have we been? And how did we get here?
Totally. And and it's also sort of related to that is this challenge of like, what gets measured and what doesn't get measured. So what gets seen in those conversations and what's rendered invisible as a result, and how does that shape decision making if we're only making decisions based upon numbers and metrics, as opposed to a sort of broader set of sort of information and voices and data. Yeah.
I'm not sure if we're answering questions yet. It looks like there was a question in the chat.
I leave it to you. I'm okay with either. If you have more,
no,
go
Valerie,
for it,
you're in charge. We'll save the questions for the end.
Okay. Yeah, I guess another question that kind of was coming up that might relate to the question in the chat is that, we've had these recent, like Florida has had these recent setbacks in terms of, primary education and educating people on, just the basics, the history basics. Do you think that it's the responsibility of, universities to make up for that time and that lack of education in some states, and require some of these ethical and justice-based classes?
I think so. If I understand correctly, you're saying if K through 12 is not getting the support it needs, should universities be required to step up and fill that gap?
Yeah.
I think that's a really complicated question, and it's a good one. I think if we're going to give someone a set of tools, I think it behooves us to help them learn not just how to use it, but if and when, and the limits and these sorts of things. So I think that if we intend to continue to train people to be engineers, and they aren't equipped with the skills to think critically about engineering, then absolutely we have to do that as well, if that's what it requires. How we go about that, I think, recognizing, and I think this has been a problem in higher ed, I'm sure this is a problem in most industries, we have a lot of navel gazing and we focus on the university and we don't think about the university as part of a larger collective of educational institutions. So how might university, I mean, at my own university, this is common throughout the United States, as states slowly defunded the university, which they've done, like the funding per student has dropped precipitously in the last 20 years. Instead of focusing on making the case that what we provide is worth funding by the state, we've instead gone out and sought private funding and tuition fees increases, and that sort of let the state feel like, well, clearly you didn't need us. You made this work without us, so why would we fund you even more? I think it really behooves us to make the case that we offer something valuable, but that also means that we have to do this together with others, that like, K through 12 is really important, and we don't work without K through 12 being excellent. So let's also lend our support to the voices that are trying to push, you know, political figures to fund that and recognize the value of that. So I think we have to do this in collaboration rather than looking at it, well, they're not doing it, let's do it ourselves. So I think there's a yes and maybe in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting because I kind of you know, working on my dissertation and everything, thought, you know, I think everybody should have at least a chapter reflecting on the you know, social implications of the work that they're doing.
Well,
You
so
know.
let me tell you how that went down for me. I finished my PhD in 2010 here at Berkeley, and one of my advisors, who will remain anonymous, said to me as I produced a second-rate chapter on that topic, said to me, well, that's fine, but that's extra. We're not counting that as what you have to do to get your dissertation. So this was a time when doing that work was basically volunteer work, and you weren't going to get credit for that. You still needed a full, quote, engineering dissertation. And this is that idea that certain things are engineering, other things aren't engineering, and you still need it to be all engineering. And I think that's a major problem, because that's like a direct signaling that, like, this is what counts and what you get rewarded for. That's going to take you away from the work on publishing or the work on, you know, your trajectory. And I think that's a unfortunate position that people shouldn't be put in. I think, quite like you put it, it should be the opposite, that you shouldn't be able to do this work without demonstrating that you understand the politics and the ethics that are involved in the work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I that made me think of the sort of changes in funding throughout administrations and their priorities. Because I remember when I was starting grad school and I was working with Dr. Louie, you know, we had to sit down and say the election wasn't what was expected, and we can't necessarily rely on the funds from the EPA to support your work, you know, for the next 4 years. So yeah, it does, I would say, burden the PhD students, because, you know, I had to TA during my whole time here, which is, you know, a little bit of an extra work, and I think it was worth it, but it takes away some of the focus of your research. And there's a lot of other disciplines that you don't have to do that. You can full go into your research because it's, you know, working on DoD algorithms that, you know, help shoot down missiles or something.
To at best shoot down missiles, at worst shoot down people, right? So yeah, totally with you on that. And I think this is part of the longer trajectory of the defunding of the humanities and the social sciences and the prioritization of STEM, because that brings a return on investment through taxes and that sort of thing that, like, is missing ultimately. I mean, the origins of public higher education are also fraught. Like, they're not clean. I mean, there were definitely some of these ideals around, you know, equity and meritocracy and education and the liberal arts were sort of core, but there was also an emphasis on engineering and agriculture. And predominantly, there's a really great short clip by Dr. King about the sort of origins of land grant schools, that these schools were granted all of this capital at the same time that African Americans were denied the promised 40 acres and a mule. And that was precisely, and their mission was to support agricultural interests, which is at that time white interests, because Black folk were being denied those agricultural possibilities. And so our schools have these dirty histories with them too, which are messy, and thinking about what gets funded and what doesn't. But I think this is, again, a political question that to the extent we believe these are important priorities, we have to work to make sure that's understood and to battle over those budgets and what gets funded and what doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah, my internal department actually had a, I'd say, pretty heated exchange about the history of our school and some of the issues within our department in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, right during the protests that were happening a few years ago. And it was, I mean, it helped me learn some of my internal biases and recognize a little bit of where I was coming from. But yeah, it was just a interesting conversation about the history of UVA, which has a lot of racism and really holds up Jefferson as this, and it's at the core of it, I think, discourages some groups from feeling comfortable in the environment, in the learning environment.
And engineering as a discipline has this problem too, of systematically excluding some people from the practice of engineering. UC Berkeley's had that struggle too, like really hard to create an environment that is inclusive. And it's not just who gets into the school, but it's also like how people are, like the hidden curriculum, which a lot of people write about, this idea of like how there's sort of a hidden curriculum that says whose culture, whose values are sanctioned in the classroom spaces and whose aren't, and what happens when you work in teams and project work, and like how this sort of supports certain people to make it through these programs and gets in the way of others. And I think these are some of the things that I think we need to be working on for sure.
Yeah, and I think it also happens at the level of administration and professors, where we've noticed that the professors of color end up having to take on the burden of inclusiveness, not burden, sorry, but have to take on the role of, we're the people that have to include because other people are not.
I would actually stick with your term burden, because they literally have to do the committee work and the work, the caretaking work. And this is also deeply gendered too, and it's well recognized the ways of who does that caretaking work of students and who is ultimately doing the work and not getting the same credit for it in their R&T file, rank and tenure files along the way. I think that's part of that process. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, and in academia, we're driven by, publications and grants. So the work that isn't surrounding that is not as attractive and promoting your career.
Totally. Yeah. 100%.
I am happy to open up some questions. It seems like we've gotten some good ones in the chat, if you want.
Yeah, thanks, Valerie and Khalid. Wow, thank you for that wide-ranging and open discussion about what it's like to do this work as engineers. I think that's so important for everybody to recognize, to hear, and to be able to share with each other. So thanks for that. Yeah, we have some awesome questions in the Q&A. Feel free to add more as we're going. We have some questions. The first question is about how novices like undergrads might learn and practice ethical thinking. So really, Khalid, what does it mean to teach students to be critical engineers? How do we do that?
I think that's a good question. I'm not an ethics teacher, although I do teach a lot about ethics and try to get people to think about ethics. In my very limited experience, what I'll say is that students are beautifully not afraid to call a spade. And so in some ways that can be easy. I think it's setting up the conditions where you can show the politics at play in any issue. That's an abstract answer. Let me get more specific. I think anytime we're talking about a project, we can require understanding the history of the communities and of the work we're doing. Then there's two levers there. There's history of the community where this project's happening, and also history of the kind of work we're doing. If we're building a bridge, let's talk about the history of bridges and think about what that looks like, as well as the communities that are being connected or not by this bridge. we can require that they think about the context. And when I say require, I'm thinking about lit reviews and stuff like that. We can require that they think about the context of that work, like what are the demographics in the places where the work's happening? What are the sort of protections or lack thereof in these spaces around environment and around people and displacement and stuff like that. So I think when we push students to investigate the history and the context of the work that they're doing, it kind of automatically brings forward these questions, and we can prime them to think about difference, marginality, forms of domination in that process. And I think that opens up the space to think about, okay, ethics. The final piece is, again, their own relationship, maybe a little trickier with students, but thinking about who's profiting, what kind of profits are being made off of these projects, and do we think that's okay? It's not, I'm not a person who believes it's not okay to make money off of something, but I think that it's a question of what happens when a system enables certain people to constantly profit off of other people. What kind of profits do we think are okay? Can we add transparency to that process? I think students will happily dive into those kinds of conversations that get them to think about a project not as this technical thing, but it's a financial thing, it's a social thing, it's a political thing. And when we invite those into the conversation, I think a lot of ethical issues become sort of automatically brought to the fore. That's been my experience, but yeah.
So true. It seems like you can't talk about engineering in the real world without actually talking about ethics.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's what you do in your
100%. 100%. And I kind of think we shouldn't be allowed to talk about engineering without talking about the real world at the same time. I don't think it's okay to talk about an abstract water treatment plant, because they're not abstract. They happen in a place, in a community, and certain people. And I think that's the way we have to think about them.
So true. Is this jiving with your experience as a TA, Valerie?
Yeah, it actually reminded me of my undergrad experience in taking an ethics class that they required. And a lot of the examples were based in, kind of civil engineering, like your boss asks you to sign off on a bridge that might break or something. When I think in real practice of engineering, it's much more nuanced, like social issues and feeling pressure from powers to make decisions in a certain way that have more social implications. So,
and there's that accountability question we were talking about too.
Yeah.
So as a follow-up, there's a question about basically, one class of engineering ethics can never be enough. So what might we do to adapt curriculum to address questions of justice?
I saw that question and I'm really happy you asked it, because that's like my favorite question. Yeah, one class is not enough, obviously. I think for me, when I think through this, sometimes I get stuck because there's a bit of a challenge. Let's say a whole class of people were educated without thinking about this, and now we want them to start including it in their teaching. It's like, but you aren't trained to think about this. Should you be the one teaching this? So there's a tension here about how do we bring this into the curriculum? Well, on one hand, one way we're going to address that tension, and I think that's more of a long-term thing, is we need to rethink who we hire as tenure track professors in our department. And if you don't have a deep knowledge in this stuff, then you're not qualified to be in this department. In the same way, if your work doesn't address issues of equity and justice, then your work's not that good. That's how I would see it. Like I would be very straightforward about, you're not a strong candidate because you're disconnected from the things that matter to us. And so I think that's the long game. And the other piece that I've been thinking about here at Berkeley in civil and environmental engineering is, I think the intro courses and the senior design courses are kind of some of the easiest to work these into. The intro courses get to reframe what this discipline is about and what it means. The senior design courses can be really rooted in these concerns about ethics in a really applied way. And I think that, and this is going to be tricky, and no slight to the person asking the question, we need to bring these courses into engineering. We need sort of engineering ethics faculty who are really rooted in engineering, so that students don't feel like this is the pass no pass course that I take as a requirement over there, but actually this is core to my curriculum, and I can't be an engineer without this. And what that means is people who have their feet in both places, which likely you do have your feet in both places. So I think there's a need to force this on the table. In my own experience, I teach a course, Engineering, Environment, Society, that's rooted in racial injustice and engineering, and sort of gets at how engineering is deeply politicized and racialized. When you teach freshmen in a course like that, it screws up every other faculty member's course, because they start asking questions when they move through the rest of their classes. And I that was a surprise outcome for me. That was really made me feel good, that these students walk in and they're like, hey, wait a second, what about this? And overwhelmingly the faculty have no clue, because they've never thought about this. And so they're like, don't know how to answer it. They feel nervous because this is a tension-filled area. And so like, I think that working on this early in students' curricula is a great way to start the process. What that's done, in my view, is it's forced the conversation at the department level in a way that now more of this is being taken into account, because professors feel tension. And they feel tension in a way they've never felt it before, where they're being challenged on things that they don't know about by students who know more than them. So I think that's a beautiful outcome. It also speaks to our need to recognize students as knowledge creators and innovators in that space, and not just recipients of information from faculty in that way. So
I love that as a generational argument for how to change engineering. So we send the students forward as, ambassadors.
I will say it requires a lot of supporting them, because wow, the frustrations they feel for the next 3 years as they move through a curriculum that like silences these issues over and over. But I see that shift happening also in building cohorts of students who work together through that. So yeah.
Yeah, and I can also imagine faculty thinking like, wow, the students do want to know that. Like there might be a bias that the faculty is assuming that students aren't that interested in the social mess of the real world. Whereas when students start to ask those questions, maybe that frees up faculty to actually tell some stories about experiences they've had like that.
Totally. And I think there needs to be some work on faculty education to make sure they understand how to think about some of these topics. And also, so this is tricky because we're talking about rank and tenure, like this needs to be rewarded for faculty to do this, because as it stands, at least at R1 schools, teaching is structurally very devalued and not that important in one's sort of tenure file. And so like, can we create a structure that rewards the kind of work that we want people to do in that sense?
Nice. So true. Yeah, that would be a systemic, an institutional problem to solve.
Yeah.
So here's a question about employment. How might students who would like to work in line with your insights go about finding a job in engineering?
I often laugh at these employment questions, because probably the least qualified people to help you think about employment are going to be faculty, because they have such a weird way of applying for jobs and so different from the rest of the world. So we'll give you ideas, but you better take them with a grain of salt. I think when I think about this in terms of, there are some like go, no go questions, like if it's a job that's working on building prisons, for me, that's a no go. And like, there are those black and white issues. Those are the easy ones. Outside of that, I think thinking about spaces where the sort of values embedded in the work line up with your values. I'm deeply suspicious of the sort of shareholder-held corporate model that's beholden to the pursuit of nonstop growth and profit. The family-owned business, that's a little different, because they can be held to different values, and there can be discussion around like, is this the values we want to do? So I think that's a way that I think about this. There's also other forms, whether it's the B Corp or the nonprofit or the government agency. These are all institutions with different structural imperatives. And I find it really useful to think about, what are the structural incentives in the space where I'm going to go work? And will those structural incentives encourage me to be the person I want to be, to do the kind of work I want to do? And that's a different way of thinking about it, thinking about who's doing the exact right work, which is itself interesting. If you find that and you want to run with that, go for it. But I think that work will shift over time, and what structurally incentivizes you in the way you want to be incentivized. So if you really want to be incentivized to be an excellent teacher, probably being a faculty member in R1 is going to be a tension for you, because you're being asked to do one thing and you want to do another. And in the same way, if you want to be incentivized to do work that makes as much money as possible, well, Goldman Sachs is out there, Bank of America is out there, go for it, you know? But like, if you want to be incentivized to think about community concerns, find a place that will give you the space and reward you for doing that work. That's a way that, and ask those kinds of questions in interviews about like, you know, how do people spend their time, and what do you think about insert example? Like, is that the kind of thing you would encourage or not encourage, to make sure that what you want to be encouraged to do lines up with what you're being asked to do.
Yeah, so true. Valerie, you have any insights on this? You're close to the job market.
Well, I was going to say in a couple months, I should be able to tell you better. But actually, what I've noticed is that just now from 5 years ago, there's a lot more in terms of job opportunities when it comes to, you know, these issues. It seems like there's a DEI position for every place now, but also you kind of have to make the decision, like you were saying, what are the trade-offs between money and, you know, are you going to go work for Goldman Sachs? Are you going to work for an NGO or for the government, you know, where you're in a position to actually make those changes? And that is a position of privilege to be able to make that decision. And also whether you can feel like you have the voice to speak up if your employment place does not have that sort of inclusion aspect. Can you add it to, you know, what is your added value to some place that might not actually be considering those problems right now? So.
Yeah, thanks for that. So true. We often tell our students that the most powerful moment they have is when they're selecting who they're going to work for all of these issues, in terms of thinking through what they want to be doing and how they want their work to be rewarded. And if you want to know more about this, come to our November talk, which is going to be a speaker panel of 5 recent engineering graduates who are working in sustainability roles in industry. So come and hear from them what it's like to do this kind of work in capitalism. So we have like 1 minute left, but I'd love to hear your answers to this question, which is, you know, we're always saying engineers should be responsible for more things like social justice, like environmental justice. What about the argument that engineers should be working with different kinds of experts on interdisciplinary teams to try to encompass all of these roles rather than putting it all on engineers?
That's a really great question. I think it's another one of those yes and answers where, like, yes, we absolutely need to work on more interdisciplinary teams, but I think that as we can't offload our personal moral ethical responsibilities off to an expert somewhere else, right? And I think that there's this balance between both. We don't necessarily have to become the sort of ethics professor. That's not what I'm saying here, but we do need to be well versed in those spaces and understand how they relate to the actual work that we're doing. So I think that there's sort of a balance in there. And for example, like, we don't need to become the member of a community where we're doing a project, but we do need to be well versed in the issues that are facing that community, and we need to have members of that community involved in the decision making around that project. So I think it goes both ways, that there's a bit of like what we need to learn, but also who we need to include and the terms upon which they're included. So often the terms of inclusion are very unequal, and ultimately it's the physics, chemistry, and biology that dominates the decision making as opposed to the ethics and the justice-based perspectives, which is a real tension.
On that note, let's finish this off. What a fantastic way to send us off into the rest of the day. So thank you so much to all of you, from me to we. It's been awesome to have you guys on, both listeners and speakers. And thanks a million to Khalid Kadir, to Valerie Michelle, to the OEC's director, Dr. Rosalind Byrne, and to our coordinator, Courtney Walker. Thanks. Hope to see you at future talks.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Valerie. That was great.
Yeah, thank you.